Welcome to F360, Indiana Folklore and Folk Life. Your reading for today's class was Investigating Identity in Folk Art by Simon Bronner. He writes about a conflict that emerged between the fields of folklore and art history. A branch of art historians had latched on to the term folk art to refer to the untrained painting styles of artists such as Grandma Moses. These often nostalgic paintings of memories had caught the attention of popular culture in the mid-20th century, and art historians marshaled these works under their purview as folk art, the creative efforts of untrained artists. Their interpretations often focused on the primitivism or raw nature of the work. Folklorist John Vlach took great offense at this use of the word folk. Folklorists had used this compound word to refer to things like this ornamental iron gate made by Charleston blacksmith Philip Simmons. He continued a tradition of African-American ironwork in the city that dated to before emancipation. For folklorists, when they said folk art, they wanted the term to refer to art that was both traditional, in that it was passed down, but also one that was rooted in a very particular community or group, those two concepts that we've been talking about. For them, it was a material form of artistic communication in small groups. And there were lots of reasons for this conflict, one of which being that there were large amounts of federal funds that were being designated towards folk art in the United States. And folklorists had been working to document ethnic and community traditions and look at the traditional arts of those groups. And here was another group of scholars that said, hey, we want some of that money too to fund our exhibitions of these individuals. Anyway, a feud began between these two fields. Art historians felt they understood the art part, which centered around the individual creativity. Folklorists felt strongly that they got the folk part, which looked at the art through its socio-cultural lens, the folk group. Simon Bronner's essay presented a way forward, the behavioral approach. This attends to the individual's creative work as a part of a greater socio-cultural context. In fact, both the earlier art historical and the folkloristic approaches were flawed. They were only partial. The art historians looked at these works as the creations of lone outsiders, savants, unlettered geniuses, while folklorists often acted as if whole communities made things, when actually individuals within those communities make things. So Bronner's approach alleviated these problems by showing how individual work is created within a cultural context. The groups we are a part of shape our expressive behavior, and we, in turn, respond to that group. The bulk of his essay looks at the art of Anna Bach, whose real name was Emma Schrock. She didn't want her name out there, but she signed her painting, so I feel comfortable calling her Emma Schrock now. She's since passed. She was an old order Mennonite woman who had a disability. She had this diminutive build that Bronner writes about. In a community that valued communal labor and productivity, she had to find something to do to contribute to her community and to support herself. So she became an artist. And I'm just going to gloss over this. The essay goes into a lot more detail. But she painted genre scenes of family farms, landscapes, buildings, and social functions within her community. She also painted her memories and made small plaques and other crafts that were valued by people in her Mennonite community. This is an old order Mennonite community, so a buggy Mennonite community. However, each of her paintings, or all of her creative acts, had to conform to Ordnung, which is a German word that means just order, the unwritten rules of the church and the community. It's those unwritten strictures that define what is allowed and what is not allowed. Whether you have hooks or buttons on your clothes, whether it's black or dark blue, what style of hat, what style of bonnet, what type of buggy, all of these things are kind of understood within very particular, relatively small church groups and social groups within the Mennonite and Amish communities. So in keeping with this, she didn't paint portraits, partially because she preferred to paint landscapes, but also because the community practice of not having graven images She refrained from painting people in most of the images she created for her community, and usually didn't add facial features or too much detail to figures that appeared on the landscapes that she created. As Bronner points out, she's an individual artist with individual aesthetics and skills and abilities, but she's also a community member. She also has to make things that are appropriate for her customers, whether they're in her community or outside her community. When she makes for people in her community, she often made smaller, less conspicuous paintings, usually of someone's barn, their farm, or a family homestead, such as this image of John Schrock's farm. In the painting, there's a distinctive German bank barn built into the side of the hill with a ramp leading up to the door. Another example is her painting of D.L. Hochstetter and Sons buggy shop. When you look at this scene, you realize that it's not a general buggy shop, but an actual place from a distinctive perspective. There are people in the scene, but they're working and from a distance, and their faces are not visible. One could imagine that she made this for Mr. Hochstetter to hang in his shop. When Emma made for the English, that's the term they use for people from outside their community. So when she made for the English or for the folks outside her community, she often made pieces that were more nostalgic and idealized. Lots of covered bridges, more people in the scenes. They were often, though, scenes of community life within the Mennonite community and activities, social activities. A popular one was maple syruping, an activity that continues within the Mennonite community. It's going out and harvesting the sap to cook into maple syrup during a certain time of year. The tourists also really loved these images of maple syruping. When Emma made her pieces for her family, she'd make them conform to the knowledge of community life. She had to paint the buggies and the harnesses and the barns and the houses just right. They had to be correct to the local way of doing things. But when she painted for others, she made them to conform to their interests. An example of this is comparing these two maple syruping images. One is a winter scene, the other is a fall scene. Both show them collecting sap from the maple trees to boil into syrup. However, if you know anything about maple syruping, you know that it's not a fall activity. The sap doesn't flow until February. I don't know why she painted this fall scene, but one could imagine that fall scenes sell better, or maybe someone said they wanted a picture of maple syruping and they wanted some fall trees in there, and customers always right, and so that's what she painted. She also created scenes of harvest activities and things like making apple butter, or this image here of a husking bee. While these seem like images that could be popular in her home community, in reality they probably weren't. The large husking bee image is one of my favorites. It's ethnographically interesting, but its size clues us to the fact that it was really way too big to be used in a Mennonite home. It was probably painted for a specific folk art collector that valued scenes of the communal life of the Mennonite. And you can see this in a lot of the other images that she created, such as this family dinner that shows the family eating around a large family table, perhaps for a holiday. Toys and braided rugs on the floor. There's a wind-up clock and flowers hanging on the wall, while the snow covers the ground and the barn outside. Similarly, she has a scene of family working and making and selling apple butter, and this image of a family Christmas scene. All of these would have been highly desirable for folk art collectors, for whom she was doing a lot of her work by the mid-1980s. Popular images for her paintings included scenes of Mennonite schools, such as this spelling bee image from 1990, and also, as I mentioned, the communal images like the husking bee and maple syruping and barn raising, images that provide a glimpse into Mennonite life hidden from most outsiders. She still made these images reflect the reality of local life, though. Men building the barn, women preparing the food, keeping with the social norms of the Old Order Mennonite. The image is too big and too active to be one for a Mennonite or Amish home. Another example was the auction sale. Like syruping, she painted many versions of this type of scene, showing the community gathered for the sale. Auction items outside, auctioneer on a flatbed wagon. Some images show the men attending the auction while the women tend to the food. But in this image, quilts play a larger role. As we will discuss in our lecture on festivals, quilts at auctions provide an inversion of gender roles in the Mennonite community, where women become the moneymakers. The point here is that Emma Schrock was not an artist that folklorists would have originally looked to. Her art was too individual. However, most art historians would have focused on the composition, color, and techniques of her work rather than delve too deeply into the particulars of Emma's culture. To understand her work, like most examples of folk art, you need to have both an understanding of the cultural context and the individual's cultural life.